Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for our session on collaboration and pathways to impact. Just to introduce myself, my name's Kev Harris. I think I've met lots of you on the call today. I'm part of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, working alongside Katie, who's here along the call. She doesn't feel the need to necessarily introduce herself. Everyone knows who Katie is. But alongside me, I've got Simon Armour, Emma Hindle, and Jodie Bridger from Doncaster. So, Simon, did you just want to introduce yourself quickly and then hand over?
Yeah, Simon Armour. So I'm part of the NELP team based at Sheffield Hallam University and particularly working on the configurational comparative analysis, which is what we'll be talking about shortly.
Thanks, Simon. Emma?
Hi, everyone. I feel like you probably know me from old learning seminars, but yeah, I'm just helping with the technical stuff today. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and let's not forget how important people like Emma are in terms of producing the session and being here alongside us. So thank you so much, Emma, for that. Jodie?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jodie Bridger. I lead the Get Doncaster Moving work, which is originally one of the 12 local delivery pilots and now placed partnerships with Sport England. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you, Jodie. And so, Simon, if you could just start to share the slides for today.
Yeah.
And I suppose just to clarify from the outset, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction and set out an agenda for the session. But the key thing to kind of say from the outset is that the way that we design these sessions are there to facilitate learning or to get that learning process going. But it's not just one of those, turn your camera off or just sit back there and hear us talk. We have got some interaction built in today. And I won't go through the agenda in too much detail because obviously it's all to follow. But essentially, what we're looking to do today is really get into a little bit more of the nub around what some of the findings are that have coming out of the CCA work. So, for example, what we call configurational comparative analysis, which many of you are either involved in terms of your completion of the system maturity matrix questionnaire survey every autumn, and that many of you build into your cycles of learning and action. But also there's some of you, I'd imagine, on the call today who are about to embark on this for the first time. So essentially, we wanted to create a space today to kind of bring some of the findings, particularly around collaboration and those different pathways to impact to life. So Simon in particular will talk a little bit more about that in terms of some of the headline findings that we've created and already started to share previously anyway. But I think really valuably, and thank you so much. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Jodie from Doncaster, who's going to actually be sharing some of the examples of what this sort of stuff means for her in relation to the work in Doncaster. So we're hoping that by the end of the session, you'll get a really good understanding around where have we been with this, where are we now? But when I say we, it's kind of this idea of collective action, all of us in terms of making sense and making use of these conditions. So I hope that all makes sense. So Simon, if you could just move over to slide 3. And if anyone has any questions throughout the session, feel free to use the chat. We have obviously ourselves, but also Katie is going to be sort of like moderating the chat and making sure that people have a space to reflect. But also if there are any particular questions, we can pick those up in there as well, in and around the breakout rooms that we essentially have. So just before we move into an interactive session where we're just going to get you chatting a little bit, just to clarify, I suppose, the purpose of the workshop today. So from your perspective, we're hoping that in terms of that understanding of what CCA is, the configurational comparative analysis piece of work, that the understanding of that starts to build and is enhanced. And as we go a little bit deeper to think about how and why certain combinations of the conditions that we're seeing through the work can start to shape those different outcomes. So what we call intermediate outcomes that we're starting to see. And I think the key thing that we're constantly reflecting on and we're trying to drive is this idea about how can we start to use and build on this learning in practice. So how does the learning that comes from this piece of work help yourselves, it helps us to refine or inform the work that we do around this thing called place-based systemic working, essentially. So we're really hopeful that that comes across quite nicely today. From our perspective, we're always passionate about having a good relationship with the places and yourselves, and to be able to share the findings that are coming out of CCA with you in an interactive way, but also in a safe space, so that if you feel that you want to ask any questions, if there is anything that doesn't necessarily make sense, that we've got that kind of relationship where you can do so. I think that's really important, and that really comes down to this idea of building confidence for us all, really, in terms of using it, because we know that when everybody completes a survey each autumn, that survey is not just yourself sat down behind a computer completing it. You're doing it in a collective way with lots of other people across your systems contributing to it. So there's also something there about how you communicate the findings of that back into that cycle. And of course, we have an opportunity to capture some of those reflections and feedback. So that's hopefully a succinct enough introduction to the session. Again, going back to what I said about it being interactive, what we would like to do for the next 5 minutes is Emma's going to pop you off in a second into what we call a buzz session. And in a buzz session, we're just simply talking about 5 minutes to just get to know someone and just talk about what it is. Why did you come today, or what are you looking to gain from today's session, essentially. So Emma's going to send you off, and then you've got 5 minutes, and then we will come back, if that is okay. Right, everybody, I take it has been abruptly ended mid-flow in conversation. So sorry about that. I know everyone can talk for a long time, and obviously 5 minutes doesn't always do us justice. But I hope that those initial 5 minutes that you had were useful, just to start to open up a little bit and share some sort of reflections around some of the things that we're looking to gain from today. I'm not going to go around anyone. I'm not going to ask anyone to feedback, because we'll have some time for that a little bit later on. But what I'd like to just do now is very, very briefly, before I hand over to Simon, is to just remind us all, really, in terms of the conditions, and in particular the condition that we're focusing on today, of collaboration. So everyone will know, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but it's more a case of clarification, because I think we're all more than familiar with the 9 cross-cutting conditions that underpin the system maturity matrix that obviously feeds the CCA process. So we have the foundational conditions of processes of identifying barriers and enablers, through to organizational policies, then capacity and capability across the workforce. And then we have the ways of working conditions, which are collaboration, which is what we are focusing in depth on today, leadership, and then community-led action. And then within the settings, we have the 2 conditions of cultures and practices, and then we have the built and natural environments. And then the last one, embedding learning and action, is around those cycles of learning and action that we build into our work, in terms of making sense of the impacts that we are seeing, essentially. So I won't spend too much time on that. We wanted to raise it in the beginning, really, just to ensure that everyone was aware of what we were talking about. But in terms of collaboration, just to clarify, what does this mean, and why is it important? I think everyone would say that they are very much engaging within collaborative practices across the wide range of place-based work that we're involved in terms of tackling those inequalities that are impacting on people's physical activity. But essentially, some of the key points there, just to point towards, is this idea of organisations working together within and across policy areas to really start to tackle those systemic barriers and create these physical activity opportunities. This idea of creating a shared purpose that is widely owned across the different partnerships that we have. So everyone taking a sense of accountability and ownership for this type of work, and what we mean by collaboration. This idea of the sharing decisions is routine. It's equitable, so everyone has an opportunity to have a say in it across all different levels of the system, from communities all the way through to those who have a lot of power, perhaps, in making decisions. The last two, this idea of contradictions in policy and practice, are routinely unravelled and resolved. So we know that working collaboratively isn't always straightforward. Sometimes it's incredibly complex, it's challenging, and sometimes it involves this word disrupting or challenging the way that certain things have done. And that essentially requires working in a collaborative sense. And the last point there is about collaborative practice being the norm and persists beyond individual relationships, where we're moving beyond this idea of working in silos or just working to one sole mission. We're on a peripheral level thinking about the different things that are operating outside of our practice and who actually sits within that. So just really quickly, I just wanted to go over those two slides just to bring this particular condition of collaboration to life. And I'll hand over to you now, Simon.
Thanks, Kev. So first of all, just we're not going to revisit this in great detail. It is something you have seen before, and you can read more about it on the website if you're not that familiar with it. But just to explain that what we're focusing on today is the way in which some of those contexts and the way that resources are used, together with those changing system maturity conditions, the conditions which Kev was just describing, can lead to those short-term outcomes. And we have our theory of change is that then will enable progress towards those longer-term outcomes that we're all working towards in terms of physical activity levels across the population. So in terms of what we're doing today, we're sort of bringing together our analysis from two approaches really that are combined under the NELP methodology, basically. So we've got some configurational comparative analysis, which is basically simply a way of identifying those sort of overall patterns across the different places. So I'll talk more about that in a few moments. But basically, it includes that sense-making workshops and the moderation meetings. So it's quite a participatory process. And then it's also about our analysis and interpretation of those evaluation and learning reports, which people basically submit. And we're looking to draw out of that more in-depth understanding at individual place level. And there's a kind of, that then talks to what we're seeing in terms of the patterns. So if we see a pattern, then we need to dig into the individual places to understand exactly why we might be seeing those patterns. And that's what we've been doing recently. So in terms of the data that we're collecting, basically we identified 46 different ways or dimensions in which places can differ from each other. So there's huge diversity in places, and in terms of where they are, the resources available, the context they're working in, but also where they are in terms of system maturity. So we've sought to capture and measure each of those, and for those 47 places that have taken part in the CCA last September, October. We then went through a process, quite a rigorous process really, very much about a dialogue between the NELP team and the places to assess where places are in relation to those 46 measures, and then using the CCA software to identify those sort of common patterns that we're seeing across places, and then trying to make sense of those in collaboration again with the places that are taking part, as well as through that deep dive into what's coming out of the evaluation and learning reports. So getting into what did we find, just very briefly at this point. Obviously today we're looking at moderation, and the first point, if we look at this chart, is it was on a scale of 0 to 7, and only 2 places reached what we call the embedded level, which is 6 or 7. and only 14 scored 5 or above. So most places are at what we'd call the emerging or establishing level for this way of working in practice. So it's not a 50-50 split by any means. What we've done is we've divided it though in a way that makes logical sense, I think, really. So we wanted to look at those that are really approaching that embedded stage, if they're not quite there yet, including those that have scored 5. So that gives us 14 cases that we're classing as higher levels, and the other 33 that scored less than 5, the lower levels. Now, in CCA, we talk about the outcome being present or absent, and that's sort of another way of sort of just showing how those cases are divided up. We know in reality, as we've been discussing it, it is a spectrum. You can actually look at this and put a dividing line somewhere else and perhaps get different patterns, but we do have a theoretical logic for based in the descriptor that we provided, that we think this seems a sensible place to make that divide. So basically dividing those 47 places into 2 groups, higher or lower. And we do that for each of the measures. So this is the kind of headline findings, and we've presented this in the past in decision trees, which many of you will have seen. I thought we'd try an alternative way of presenting some of these findings, which doesn't have the same level of detail as the decision tree, but in other words, maybe easier to digest and to get your head around, basically. So in this process, we identified 9 subconditions that most plausibly are likely to affect the levels of collaboration. And then we ran the CCA analysis. I won't go into the details about the technicalities of that, but basically this tells you which ones are most predictive of the higher levels of outcomes. So which, if you've got this condition, do we find that present in every case that we've got the outcome? And the strongest predictor is the processes to facilitate place-based systemic working. I'll just click on to the next bit. What this shows is that all these 4 were strongly associated with the outcome, but it is on a spectrum. So the strongest really of those 4 were block processes. Strategic leadership came out very strongly predictive, and then that data capture on the barriers and enablers, and also the partner capacity and capability building. So people that have invested in that so places that got all 4 of those tend to have the outcome of higher collaboration that we're looking for. When we actually sort of then took this and looked at the evaluation and learning reports, that also pointed to the importance of these conditions. So we're quite confident that there is something going on here that makes those conditions important. At this point, we're going to hand over to Jodie, who's going to talk about Doncaster's story, and then later we'll return to the configurations in a bit more detail and talk about why we think we're seeing these patterns.
Thanks, Simon. And just before I suppose I hand over to Jodie, I can't see you yet, Jodie, on my screen. There you are. Is just to clarify that Jodie's going to give her presentation now and talk about the work in Doncaster, and then we're going to have a good bit of time for some questions and answers as well, in addition to anything that you pose in the chat. And of course, I don't think I mentioned it at the start, we will give you a break as well, a nice movement break after this. So Jodie, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Simon, and hi again, everyone. For the next 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to try to bring some of the conditions to life through examples, but forgive me that within the time constraints, there might be much more information or further questions that you have. So I know that there's an opportunity to sort of ask those on this session. But as always with things like this, there's an open opportunity for further conversation about anything we discuss in the session and afterwards. So next slide, please. I'm not sure who's driving, so yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. So just sort of linking back to Simon's final slide there. Again, I can't talk about this in loads of detail, but I thought it'd be helpful to share with the group Doncaster's, I suppose, assessment of those conditions that predict collaboration. The four are on screen, but for the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on the strongest predictors, which are the processes, so 2A, and then the strategic leadership. And then we'll take a deeper dive into what that means for our collaborative practice as an outcome in Doncaster. Next slide, please. So in terms of the processes, this is quite a busy slide, and some of you might have heard me talk about this previously, but in Doncaster, we sort of categorise our 4 very broad stakeholder groups who are involved in the work and involved in the change. We have a core team who you can see in the sort of blue section of this diagram. And the team fulfills what we term locally, and others will be sort of familiar with this language, as a backbone function, which essentially is the capacity to help facilitate and convene cross-organisational working. So we're a small team who are based within the public health department within the local authority, but we very much work on behalf of the collaborative and on behalf of the partnership. So and you can see some of the functions on the right hand side. So pretty much a coordination role to support vision, strategy, aligning resources, so it's establishing a shared monitoring and measurement process, of which the maturity matrix is right at the very heart of. And there are just types of examples of the way that the team works with the wider partnership to support the cross-organisation collaboration. And very much has a role around connecting up and through and down across the stakeholders involved. So we work alongside a local approach called Well Doncaster, which is the backbone function for how we engage communities and engage residents in systemic change in the borough, not just for physical activity, but for wider health inequalities as well. And that's rooted in our public health approach and our Team Doncaster collaboration across the borough. The team also facilitates and supports our wide network of groups and organisations who are involved in delivering our strategy for physical activity in sport, and I'll come on to more about that later. And we're supported and guided by an advisory board, which is a group of senior representatives, again across a range of organisations from a range of sectors, particularly operating at a senior leadership level to influence and advocate strategic priorities and unlock, I guess, systemic challenges that we're facing across the work, not just for physical activity, but again, that impact wider health inequalities in the borough. Next slide, please. And much of our, I suppose, context around the work started way before we were announced as a local delivery pilot in 2016. So physical activity in sport has been a strategic mayoral priority since 2016. We have an elected mayoral system. So Ros Jones is our mayor, who's just started a 3rd term in post, and physical activity in sport is very dear to her heart personally, but also recognising the value it can play to achieving her mayoral commitments. And as a result of that, it's very much been embedded in the Team Doncaster's multi-agency strategy for the borough for the last 10 years since the emergence of Get Doncaster Moving. So we've had strategic leadership and strategic buy-in way beyond sort of 10 years of Get Doncaster Moving in the local delivery pilot starting. Alongside that, the leadership of our Director of Public Health has been influential. We've had 2 DPHs over so as the life course of Get Doncaster Moving to date, and both have very much been advocates of community-centred approaches, placing high value on the wider determinants of health and how they impact or play a role in health inequalities, and therefore the role that physical activity and movement can play in achieving wider public health objectives. And I suppose the Director of Public Health has played a very influential role across the local authority and beyond, to bring other local leaders on board with us. And as a result of that, we've got strong, high-profile advocates for physical activity and sport across sectors, such as the chief executives of the hospital trusts, multi-academy trusts, our housing association, and many others across the borough. And then, I suppose, over the last 5 years or so, Doncaster's been, well, in fact, pre-COVID, we started this journey, obviously disrupted very much by it, on a journey of community-led prevention, which I guess in normal language means, I suppose, a place-based approach to tackling health and wealth inequalities in the borough, which goes far beyond the remit of physical activity and sport. But as a result of that, leadership recognising that we need to work differently at the heart of our communities to shift health inequalities. And then, of course, that opens the door for Get Doncaster Moving and physical activity and sport to play a role within that community-led prevention approach. And I guess some real life examples of what that means for Get Doncaster Moving is through the investment of the local delivery pilot, initially in place partnerships. As you imagine, we have a number of people who've been on fixed term contracts, but leadership has bought into the work and the approach over time, and has since invested in converting those fixed term roles into 3 embedded roles within public health and the local authority, recognising the longer term shift we need to take, a longer term investment we need to make into this work. And then much more widely than public health, and as a result of our work to connect various strategic decision makers on the journey with us, as an estimation, we estimate that nearly £100 million of wider investment has been leveraged from various sources to collaborate with the work that Get Doncaster Moving is doing. And I guess a fairly new marker of progress is Get Doncaster Moving is one of 4 local authorities or 4 partnerships within South Yorkshire who are part of a local ambition led by the elected Mayor Oliver Coppard of the South Yorkshire region, looking at how physical activity and sport can play a role in narrowing the health inequality gap across the South Yorkshire level as well. So across layers of the system and across partnerships, we recognise that the strategic leadership across a range of organisations is significantly opening up the opportunity for Get Doncaster Moving to support our residents. Next slide, please. So what that means for Get Doncaster Moving more specifically, I mentioned that we've had a strategy in place since 2016, and that strategy or the vision certainly hasn't shifted. So our collective and collaborative vision of healthy environment communities through movement, physical activity and sport. I guess many of you on the call will have very similar visions. Most importantly, that was co-produced with residents and a range of partners over 10 years ago to set out what we wanted to achieve in the long term. And we recognise as a result of a range of sort of methods like systems mapping and a range of tools and techniques, sort of 8 broad actions we needed to take, and you can see those in the white boxes, and then the contribution they will make to our Team Doncaster, our borough-wide multi-agency ambitions around the outside of the diagram in the coloured graphics. But we also recognise as a collective that it's not just about what we do, it's the way we do it at a community level right through to national responsibility. So those sorts of layers of footprints that we know we need to make changes that are recognised through the sort of purple and green layers of the system, if you like. So the darker purple represent, the real heart of community, right through to the lighter green on the outside, which we foresee as sort of national influence. Next slide, please. And that strategy is very much, or the framework is delivered by that sort of diverse range of organisations that make up what we know locally as the Get Doncaster Moving Network, convened in a number of different ways and spaces throughout the sort of the course of a year. A core sort of engagement model looks like typically 4 network meetings and events, pretty open agenda, but supported by more specific action groups across a number of those themes in the strategy. That's where the real work sort of gets done, I guess. The task groups where like-minded sort of people around and organisations around particular themes and topics come together and share the learning and drive work forward. And then that's connected through a relatively informal infrastructure of meetings, events, newsletters, emails, that sort of stuff. The stuff that happens in between, or I guess behind the scenes. Next slide, please. And one of the real sort of enablers to bringing people together is our shared ways of working. And again, these have been co-produced and always iterated. So we tend to look at these once a year across the partnership and check in and see if they're working for us. And there's quite a lot on there, and there's some very similar terms or ways of working, but they operate as a guidepost around bringing new partners in. So we celebrate and share what we're doing, and people join us because they share or identify with the ways of working that Get Doncaster Moving partners champion. But also they hold us to account around our behaviours. So initially these started out as investment principles around where we would spend the money of the local delivery pilot. But as time has progressed, we recognise that it's not just about investment, it's about how we work together as a group of partners is what makes the difference. So these have become sort of ways of working in the network, and it depends on sort of the number of partners involved and who's involved as to what extent we may sort of dial up or down these sorts of ways of working. But essentially they act as I said, as a guidepost or as a direction for the way that we want to establish our relationships across organisations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's a lot to take in on this slide. And again, some of you will have seen or heard me talk about our social network analysis before. So it's a tool we use to measure our collaboration across Get Doncaster Moving, and we've used it since 2018, which was our sort of baseline measure. I don't have time to talk about the model itself, but I think there'll be a link shared in the chat to a webinar, a recorded webinar I've done previously that talks more in depth about sort of how to do it and the value of it. But what you can see here is each dot represents a person who's been involved in Get Doncaster Moving since 2018. So you can see immediately that the number of people involved has significantly increased year on year. And alongside the number of people, we can start to see the connections between various people in the network. So each line represents a connection between a person. And then the thicker the line is, the stronger that connection is. So you probably can't see the detail on this slide, but our data and our social network analysis is showing us there's more people in our network taking action to reduce health inequalities. There are year on year more connections between people and groups of people, and year on year stronger collaboration. So I guess how we distinguish between the strength of collaborations in this method, for example, is a weaker connection might be knowledge sharing. So it might be that you send a newsletter out to a group of individuals, or you send an update, or you're just keeping each other abreast of, I guess, your activities, but not directly doing any work together. And then the strongest type of collaboration would be making decisions together about the way you will work, and then therefore carrying out those actions. And again, more detail on sort of the method is shared in the video. Next slide, please. Oh, apologies. If it's not too late, can you just hover on this slide? And the final thing to say on that is the different colours of dots represent, I suppose, different sectors. this is a test of my memory and under pressure here, but from memory, the green dots represent City of Doncaster Council colleagues, so local authority colleagues. Red represents the voluntary and community sector. Purple, I believe, is blimey, there's nothing like pressure, but purple represents education sector, and yellow is sort of other, and that tends to be either residents directly themselves who are part of the network analysis method, or sort of other sort of commissioned pieces of work. Next slide, please. So the previous slide showed individual level sort of analysis of who's involved in the network. This map shows at an organisational level. So, for example, in the previous map, if there were 10 people involved in one organisation that showed up, in this map, they would just be represented by one dot. But what we can see again is there are more organisations involved, and again, stronger and more frequent connections between organisations taking action around our collective ambition. Next slide, please. And to bring that to life on a really sort of hyper-local level, there are multiple examples across the work and the topics and the themes, but this is a real visual example to share on a forum like this. So a bit of background is one of our themes of work is known locally as Doncaster's Future Parks, of which we have capital and revenue investment to work with residents across 15 of our parks in our most deprived communities. Hexthorpe Park was one of the early adopters of this approach. And we started this process back in just during the pandemic, so it's 2021, and we're only just starting to see the product of our collaboration and engagement in sort of come to life. And I think what that represents is that the time it has taken us to develop those strong relationships with like-minded organisations who really want to be part of our way of working in parks and open spaces. And examples of organisations that have worked with us in this particular park, in Hexthorpe Park in Doncaster. We've got national governing bodies, we've got a wide range of local authority departments, we've got voluntary sector organisations, the Friends of groups, local clubs, and even a number of commercial enterprises. So our local escape room actually helped to design a number of interactive events and trails in the park, for example. Our transportation team, but also investment from a wide range of organisations has helped to bring this sort of transformation to life. A real key to this approach has been the resident voice being at the heart of it. It's the resident voice and our principles and way of working have been the real sort of, again, guideposts for how we develop this work in collaboration with a range of organisations and people who want to be involved. And a real key, I think, thing that we always talk about the time it takes to do this work. I think time and then open to sort of iteration. So these changes haven't all happened at once. They've been very much an evolution of ideas and evidence and prototyping various outputs in the park alongside residents. And then it's now that we're starting to see some of the more noticeable, I guess the ribbon cutting is starting to happen as a result of over 4 years of engagement and iteration with a wide range of partners. The final thing I think has been key to this is this specific example, but could be applied to many others, is the team involved in this programme and their capacity to connect people and priorities as the work has iterated. I think that's something that has really underpinned much of our collaborative projects and our collaborative work, is that the team's approach to joining the dots and bringing people in as the opportunity and the energy directs it. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just try and speed up through these final slides. So we recognise, you might have noticed that we've Doncaster have scored ourselves a 5, and in the sort of maturity matrix, there's a 6 and 7 to really truly sort of symbolise or identify a condition as being embedded. We recognise that whilst there are an increasing number of examples, they're not yet extensive across the network, and many of them are still reliant on a centralised decision-making process that drives those wider organisational collaborations. There's a heavy reliance on individual relationships and goodwill. So you find, we tend to find the right people, or the people who really want to work with us alongside those sort of values and principles. And there's a reliance on people's personal connections, either within an organisation or between organisations, that's sort of unlocking the doors and unlocking the work to happen. And we recognise we need to deepen that buy-in across within organisations, so it's not just the 1 or 2 people who are driving that work, that it's actually becoming culturally significant within organisations, regardless of the person or the people who are working there at the time. And we recognise as well, particularly with the Future Parks work, there are frequent contradictions in policy and practice, and we recognise that's probably the trickiest challenge we have locally in Doncaster around unpicking those contradictions. Often there is an unwillingness from some people or organisations or whatever to change, which is, we recognise that's normal, and that's a normal part of professional and personal lives. But that is, I guess, our greatest challenge in this particular condition, is unpicking those contradictions that exist between what organisations are committing to, and then actually how their processes and practices are either restraining that change or in fact enforcing the behaviours that aren't helpful to systemic change. Next slide, please. And Van, you might be thinking, well, what are you going to do about that then? So we're working with a number of colleagues, and I think one's on the call today, to commit to changing some of those, I suppose, leadership behaviours that might be sort of blocking that change, and in fact, working on leadership behaviours across the collaboration, across the network, to try and unlock I guess what the building blocks that we think are important for our future collaboration. So back in January, we held one of our annual summits, and the focus wasn't on what we're going to do together. It's very much on how we're going to work together for at least the next 3 years to unlock some of that change between ourselves as organisations. And what that means is we will be investing some of our place partnership investment into, if you flick onto the next page, please. I guess a curriculum or a set of learning forums or networks that really focus on, building relationships across organisations, building networks, and building trust across the partnership, way beyond the boundaries of what we currently have in place now. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate I've just sort of rattled through the last few slides there, but please take a note of our website. There is a section on there with much more learning on our collaboration and bringing more examples to life. And please do connect with us on our social media as well. I'm conscious I've gone over time. Apologies, Kevin.
Jodie,
happy to take questions.
100%. Don't apologise. I think you've done a fantastic job to cover all of that. Such richness there in terms of what you guys have been doing in Doncaster in the time that you had. So no worries at all. Thank you so much, and appreciate how critical you are as well in terms of like saying what still needs to be done and where you are, for example. So no worries at all. So going to open it up, use the next 10 minutes to open up for questions and answers, and then we're going to have a quick break. So if you have a question, then feel free to raise your hand. I know that there are some questions coming up within the chat as well, but anyone with an immediate question they would like to ask. So Claire, over to you.
Hi, Jodie. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I just had a question about, you sort of said that the team, you sort of give credence to the team for being really good at what they do and making those connections between different areas or people or projects going on. And I was just wondering, do you think that's down to sort of the personalities of those people and how they work and what their strengths are? They are good at doing that sort of work anyway, or is there anything structural you have in place about how that team works that would help facilitate that? Because I think would be a really interesting to me if it is one or the other, or I suspect maybe a bit of both, about if you have any reflections on that.
Thanks, Claire. That's a great question. And we are actually doing some work on team development at the moment. So our starting point with this, we had a number of, I suppose, thematic experts, like I don't like that word experts, but people who know their stuff in education, parks, etc., coming together. But a common thread of curiosity and a common thread of there's something in our collective behaviours and our collective ambitions and the way we want to work that did bring us together. I wouldn't say that we actively sought out those, when recruiting the team. But I do think there is something in the way we spoke about the work, the way we advertised those positions that attracted, I suppose, the relational behaviours and the skills required to operate in a relational environment that attracted those people. Had we done that again, if we were starting again now, I would have liked to think would have been even more deliberate about our recruitment processes to guarantee, I suppose, we were attracting people like that to those roles. So it's a combination of both. And what has been really helpful at socialising new team members to the way we want to work is those principles. And we aren't yet, totally familiar with those in ourselves. So we're doing some work on, deepening our real understanding of what our role is individually and as a team within systemic change. We still don't have all the answers. And it very, to use the cliche in this work, it very much is a test and learn. And we're always challenging ourselves on our own behaviours about, how we as a team position ourselves within the wider network of partners. It's something I particularly feel very strongly about. We have also done recently a webinar on sort of storytelling, and what came up quite a lot in that was how we talk about the work and the way in which we then do it forms a narrative of which the team are positioned within. So I'm waffling on now, Claire, apologies, but there is a lot in the team's behaviours and leadership styles in their own sort of personal and professional lives that has played a significant role in this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jodie. Great question, Claire, and great response, Jodie, as well. Katie, you're in the chat. Is there anything coming out of the chat that's worth picking up on?
I think there's a question that I'll pose to Jodie, and then probably others that we can just, over the course of the rest of the session, keep referring back to and adding more examples in the chat. But a question came from Corey around examples of those contradictions around collaboration that you might have come across, and I guess particularly if you've found any ways of working through them. So you might have an example, Jodie, that springs to mind. I've got a few that I'll put on the chat. But is there an example of a contradiction and any sort of tips or ideas about how you can work through them?
I'll use a parks example because that's the sort of example I shared with the group, and I'm not sure how this sits around other sort of local authorities, but in Doncaster we have sort of a model around our parks where a number of departments within the authority play a role in, I suppose, the management, the planning, the delivery, or I guess the future, the role they play in residents' lives. And a real challenge has been whereby strategically we all recognise parks and open spaces play such an important role in the health, well-being, the economy, all real sort of headline leading borough priorities. However, the practices underneath that don't necessarily align with achieving that, and there are some contradictions in where we may invest we collectively as partners in Doncaster, not necessarily Get Doncaster Moving, where Doncaster invests resources and whatever, don't necessarily connect to all those ambitions at once. So that's become a challenge in terms of the future parks work to navigate, because whilst we know we need to make, as an example, we know we need to make parks and green spaces feel safer for residents. Some approaches and some responses to that remain around sort of CCTV and lighting, but we know a lot of the evidence suggests it's around activation and the way we design the green space and the way that we talk about the green space and the way that we sort of bring it to life through storytelling. So they're sort of examples where there are different views on how we do things that might butt heads, but there's also the ways that our processes to maintain and then develop parks and green spaces may also conflict as well.
And I think it's one of those things, isn't it, Jodie, around how do you to work collaboratively means compromise in some instances, and who's asked to compromise when and over what is a challenge. But I think what we've seen in other places, at least being able to acknowledge what those conflicts are and trying to collectively resolve them is one kind of initial starting point for trying to resolve.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Jodie. I think there is one other question that I think, is it Iona in the chat has raised around how the works has influenced.
Yeah, Kev, I was going to leave that to respond in the chat, just because not everyone's in that sort of situation. If that's all right, Iona, we will think about it in the chat though.
That's fine, and that's probably a good opportunity for everyone to take a well-earned break now. But I just wanted to say thanks again, Jodie, for giving such a great presentation. Obviously, you can see lots of people are saying the same in the chat, so well done there. Really appreciate it. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone was able to stretch their legs, do a movement break, grab a coffee, whatever it may have been, and thank you for joining for the next part of the session. Again, thanks, Jodie, for your presentation, and feel free to keep posting any questions or reflections within the chat as well. So I'm going to hand over to Simon now. Simon, you're going to go a little bit more deeper into some of the findings around CCA, and then we're going to go into some bits after that as well. But Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Kev. Yeah, I'm just going to return to the output that we get from the configurational comparative analysis. So this we're going to quickly talk through this decision tree, which was the basis of the sense-making meetings that we had, talking around these conditions and how we actually achieve these. So that's the outcome on the right-hand side of the tree. And one of the most important things that we found, which didn't show in that earlier diagram, and that's why it's quite helpful to look at this as well, is that places that had lower scores on the processes to facilitate place-based systematic approaches, almost always, there's only one exception out of 25 cases, barring that one, which we're not quite confident about anyway. We find that if you haven't got those processes in place, you don't get the collaborative practice. So that's pretty much what we would call a necessary condition. So it's something that you have to have in place. I'm not saying that's universally true, but basically, in the set of places that we're looking at, this seems to be a very strong pattern. So it's quite an important bit of learning. Where places were more mature, it didn't necessarily mean that they would get the outcome, because some of those, particularly those with lower strategic leadership, tended to still be less mature, come out in that group of the 33, that's one a little bit lower on this. But where they had both, there's quite a strong relationship represented by that thick line, that they were more likely to have that be in that group of 14 places with the higher levels of collaborative practice. So moving on, this is drawing on not just that configurational analysis, but also the process that went through, where we kind of dug into the evaluation and learning reports and the way that has kind of demonstrated and evidenced how some of these things might be happening, why we're seeing these sort of patterns. Yeah.
Simon, can I just, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Naomi can't
sure.
see the slides. I can see the slides, but can I just get a...
Oh, right.
Okay, they can see. It's carry on. I think it must be Naomi. Sorry, Naomi. Rochelle, can you not see the slides?
No, I was raising my hand to say I could, sorry.
Okay, fab. No, carry on then. Naomi, sorry, I think it's your side. Sorry to interrupt you, Simon. It's no problem. It's Naomi.
Right, okay. Yes, I'm glad you can see what we're looking at anyway. So yeah, one of the things that we found was that networks were one of the most commonly featured things reported in people's evaluation and learning reports when they were talking about collaboration. And there's no doubt that those are really valuable and very important to actually sort of developing collaboration. And so some examples, they're sort of in the bubbles showing ways in which people may be beginning to recognise that. There might be some people there bringing together as people that are really passionate about it. People beginning to realise the benefits of working together on it as well. So what we found is that in order for that to get beyond that emerging, establishing level, we need to be sort of moving across to thinking about some of those governance, funding, team structures, things like performance management, those kind of processes that can actually work against real collaboration in practice. So where we see the real change taking place towards more collaborative actual practice, not just talking about what you're doing, but actually changing what you're doing and doing that together. Then it's places that have actually sort of tackled some of those discrepancies in terms of differing targets, things like that, different priorities. Sometimes you focus on short-term activity and just measuring that rather than long-term goals. So it's thinking about all those aspects of the system processes, the way the system works, the way it kind of maintains the status quo if we don't actively seek to change that. So this basically the collaboration emerges not just from that capacity or leadership, but also where we've got that. So some of these changes that we might see taking place, those kind of structures that provide that sort of inclusive, long-term, trust-based engagement. So giving people more of a say in decision-making, unlocking that potential of the capacity that's there to deliver change. So where there's a will and a desire to change, how do we actually enable that to happen by removing some of those barriers and facilitating that collaborative working. And also, leaders using their relational and positional power to align priorities. And we saw some of that in Doncaster, didn't we, with the alignment with sort of wider public health priorities and the mayoral plan and so on, and how that can then also, it's also a role of kind of enabling and motivating that collaborative action by using those relational skills to engage with people and keep people on board. And that's again, as Jodie was touching on, it's that change to a kind of relational way of working. So we're not just dependent on individuals who are good at this, but it becomes more of the norm. And that is a real kind of process change of the type we'll be talking about. And where we get this right, you know, so these things all then support each other and feedback, so positive kind of feedback loops between these, which can really sort of help to deliver that diverse and sustainable collaboration on these sort of complex issues like this. So we thought we'd just take a look at some of one of the examples going back to Doncaster. But this is something that we actually picked out when we were looking at the evaluation and learning report, and obviously we shared this with Jodie, and you know, made sure it resonates. But basically, you know, this. Although we're talking about Doncaster here, this is representative of a pattern that we saw in a lot of different places. So where we found that experienced and embedded staff are sort of working together as an integrated team, then a diverse group of partners can begin to kind of identify and create opportunities for that collaborative working. And the reason for that is because in those contexts, where organisations are traditionally set up in silos with their own targets and so on that they're working towards, then a team that works together has got that capacity, which we touched on earlier, to make those connections across those organisational boundaries. That enables the creation of spaces and opportunities to collaborate, helping to identify those shared goals and you know, the mutual benefits across organisations of working together. And part of the sort of underlying mechanism that was suggested is helping this to happen really is that way when people work together as a team and forge relationships to build that trust and a kind of a team spirit, that allegiance really, you know, that we support each other and help to coalesce around some of those shared goals and beliefs and values, as Jodie touched on. And that then sort of helps to build that motivation, the confidence and so on, to actually advocate for these ways of working and practice those as well in your everyday work. So we've got another example here from one of our original place partnerships, where they've talked in some depth in their evaluation and learning report about the ways in which they've built up, the way they've used strategic leadership and addressed those processes over 7 years. You know, this is really important points really. It takes a long time, this, and obviously we're learning as we go, and you know, we can learn from each other, but it's still an ongoing process. I don't think anywhere will claim to have completely, you know, reached our goals yet, but there's some really good work happening across many places, and this is one example of it. So we've got that at that sort of strategic level. It was about building that alliance around health inequalities, the sort of collective influence to try and change wider policies, influence even government policy and so on. So, you know, people like directors of public health building those alliances. It can be across places, but also within places. And it's not just around physical activity, it's about those recognising the need for those systemic place-based ways of working, which actually are appropriate to many of the complex challenges that we're facing. It's they talked a lot about their relational approach, so prioritising that trust building, consistent engagements, so people get to know each other and trust each other, commitment to listening, really important to help build and strengthen some of those partnerships where there was mistrust in the past, particularly some of the communities that are more disadvantaged, and that's enabled that more meaningful collaboration. And as I touched on a moment ago, you know, this is a systemic change in processes, going from that transactional way of working into one that is actually about building trust, building relationships and so on. It's really important finding out of all this, I think. And by leveraging some of those non-sport and physical activity spaces as entry points. They're able to sort of help to reach out and get people involved, get people engaged. And you know, this is particularly sort of about reaching out to those communities. But equally, you know, it can apply if we're trying to engage people in different sectors. You know, it could be in health, for example, you know, which in some ways can operate as in quite a different world. It's about sort of thinking about how do we build those connections and, you know, patients, relationship investment rather than rigid funding models. So again, that's a systemic change in those processes. Can unlock that potential of grassroots partners, and this is something we've talked about in a lot of places. So in summary, before we go into sort of our breakout discussions, and we'll talk more about this, where we have that kind of structural capacity, and this came out in that first graphic that I shared. You know, we have that can create that potential to do this kind of systemic collaborative working. We also need those processes, things like the joint teams, the governance reform, the funding models, to actually activate that capacity, enable that to happen. Those relational mechanisms, as I've said, are sort of really strong, you know, actually fostered through actually building those teams, working together, and so on. And those collaborative outcomes then emerge when these things align, and we sort of, you know, share those mutual goals, that kind of shared purpose, which was talked about in the descriptor. So I think Kev is going to sort of just introduce the breakout sessions.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for that, and getting through that nice and succinctly. That's great. And I think I'll just add one more quick thing to that, is that hopefully people can see that that there's an element of explanatory depth to those examples as well, in terms of the if then because sort of like formula that we use in a lot of the work, and how that sometimes is a nice way to try and understand the how and the why behind some of these intermediate outcomes that we are seeing. So thank you for that. So what we would like to do now is to move you into some breakout discussions, and we have 3 questions here that we would like you to explore, which are hopefully quite straightforward. The first one is around have you found that bringing people together leads to collaboration in practice? And then the second one, how can change in organizational policies, processes and structures enable collaboration? And then the third one, how might strategic systems leadership create the conditions for collaborative practice? Don't worry, we are going to make sure that these questions are broadcast over to the breakout room that you're in, but we're just about to move you over there now. Katie, are you going to move everyone over in a second?
Yeah, just to say, we're slightly larger rooms, 4 to 5 people, so just make sure that everyone has a chance to chat when you're in there. So I'm opening those now.
Lovely. And we'll call you back around 2:35, between 2:35 and 2:40. I think we're all back. So we've got a little bit of time now to just unpack and reflect a little bit around the discussions that we had in our breakout rooms. I can't remember, I haven't seen how many breakout rooms there were, Katie. We're not going to be able to get around all of them, but it'd be nice to be able to just get some reflection and feedback from, there was 7. Okay. So is there anyone who would like to share back and reflect on some of the discussions that took place around those questions? Right. Oh, brilliant. This is amazing. 3 hands up straight away. So Corey, you were first. So did you just want to come in?
Hello. Yeah, I usually am always at these with Katie. She always leaves me face at these meetings. So just something which actually made me think, we were just discussing about kind of collaboration, I guess, at different levels, and the work that is. So we have examples in our one of our priority places where we're collaborating more with different internal teams at the council, which is really great, around assets team, etc., to try and have more of a say in keeping facilities as a sport and physical activity facility. However, there are obviously other people that are more senior that have their decisions around that although our voice is valued, when it comes to those other departments and those people that are more senior, that's kind of, well, they make the decision and that's that. And we still don't necessarily have that collaboration at that level. And that was then when we just mentioned that is the work, essentially. So collaborations is great, but it depends on at what level you're collaborating and what level you need to collaborate at in order to make sure that decisions, structures, processes, policies are either changed or informed from what we already know, because if we're working on the ground, we have all the insight to be able to give them to inform their decision making already. So yeah, it's more just about food for thought, that actually we're collaborating a lot with some of the teams, but not necessarily some of the senior people, whether it's in planning or any financial departments. So it's more just that's a takeaway for me, that collaboration needs to occur at all different levels that we're working at, not just kind of in the system level that we are in. It's above and above, below, across, everywhere, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I love that, above, below, across, everywhere.
I'm mindful of saying below because that sounds
Yeah,
rude.
no.
I don't mean it that, but it's across the spectrum, and I see my role personally as someone that is trying to connect those dots from there and merge it so that it talks to each other. So
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Corey. And before I bring in Mark, and then Claire, just remind me, a quick reflection from our group was around, we can say we're doing collaboration or just bringing people together in a room or over a series of meetings doesn't necessarily mean it's collaboration. It's about the actions that take place and what we do as a result of that, which is so important. So thank you for that. And Mark, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Kev. I've heard your name mentioned multiple times on multiple webinars. You're famous in across the sector.
Oh,
all good, so it's all good.
Oh, thank God.
First of all, I started off on a negative, and I'll just sort of put that out there to this whole group, because I find that being on lots of these NELP and Sport England and system partner webinars, a lot of the language is very academic and very confusing, and trying to translate that for not only myself in my head, but also for our team internally and then for our wider stakeholders is very, very difficult. So anything that you and any other partners can do to make it really, really stupidly simple for us would be really, really helpful. Because all these models are wonderful, but they are kind of meaningless unless they're actually practically applicable on the ground, particularly for people who don't work in this sort of with this language and with these things on a daily basis. Having said that, what we talked about in our group was superb. We had Jodie, so we were hearing from the expert, which is brilliant. And what we talked about was that this collaboration really comes down to a few things. And again, I've got to keep it simple because otherwise I sort of lose track of what I'm talking about. But it's really more about mostly about nurturing those relationships with the key stakeholders and building up who's the important people who need to be in a room across the length of your funding or the work you're doing in place. So it's nurturing those relationships to find leverage points. So which people obviously will always come with agendas to these things, but where the leverage points to actually build that trust between those partners, which can then, as a consequence, unlock that real tangible work you're going to do to make tangible change, tangible difference, and tangible impacts ultimately. And while we're all here for the people in our places. So that was kind of a very quick summary of what we talked about. I don't think pretty much sure we didn't cover all three questions, but it was very useful nonetheless.
Thank you, Mark, and your point at the beginning around translating, the complexity of the language and all that sort of stuff. We do hear that, and we do our best to try and find a space that is a common language for everyone. So 100%. Thank you for that. Claire, over to you.
Fab, thank you. Yes, it was similar to, I think it was what Corey said. We discussed about how having people come together does not necessarily mean you have collaboration, but that there are behaviours that people can do within those groups that you can see that they help. So for instance, we've got an operational group, and there's somebody who's very good at bringing other people in and at saying that somebody's not spoken yet and asking their opinion. And I think that she works in a collaborative way, and then it makes me want to work with her on collaborative things, because you know that she is somebody who would like value your opinion, and even the stuff that she does outside of this work, I'll be like, oh, I'd be really interested in working with that because I know now more about the way that she works. I get exposure to that. And then the other thing was, it was a really cool example, I thought, of how you can do something in practice, which I always find very useful, is about literally going and sitting in each other's offices for like a day a week, if you work across organisationally, and the way that that can be facilitated, that's really good. And we have that happen in other things in our office, but not necessarily to do with this work. But I think you just find more connections with people, or you can ask them quite quick questions, and there's benefits of doing that if you're able to. But yeah, I thought it was just a small practical example of how you could start trying something.
Lovely. Thank you, Claire. And that's just reminded me just of some of the conversations that came from my group. So I was with Chris, David, Sarah, and Paul, and I hope I'm paraphrasing correctly here, David, that you were talking about sometimes this idea of, we have a role to play in how we compose the groups and how we get people together, in terms of getting that right kind of dynamic, almost like the right team dynamic, and those conditions in place and those foundations in place to actually do something. So you've got that synergy. So that was just reminded me of that in terms of getting the right behaviours there, essentially. But Katie, over to you.
At risk of the academic language and Mark, wave at me the moment I say a word that you don't understand what I'm on about. Straight away, no. I'm not coming in here to sort of I guess undermine what people are saying. What I really wanted to just point out with this particular seminar today is that what we've looked at is, what does it take to get these collaborations and these partnerships kind of up and running, and where you're in a sort of network and you're making some good kind of connections, individual to individual. And then what does it take for that to become more routine and embedded and established way of working that isn't reliant on like you as individuals all the time having to kind of make those connections and be in those different spaces. And so the first part, 100%, and I couldn't agree with you more, Mark and Claire, around building that mutual trust, those connections, those relationships, finding those leverage points, creating sort of shared work together is absolutely fundamental to like starting that collaborative practice. What I suppose I'm just trying to highlight as well is that in order for that to be routine, that's when we need to see a bit more leadership for place-based working, for tackling physical activity, as well as that this is how we do things changing as well. Like, so the structures and the processes that go alongside that work being more than just the work of individuals, if that makes sense. So I think in some of the other groups, they talked about like funding mechanisms changing so that it reduces sort of competition, or structures which mean that people can work across different organisational boundaries. And when we talk about processes and structures, those are the kind of things that we're trying to talk about. So it's not to discount what you're saying at all. I suppose I'm just trying to outline that whole kind of spread of maturity of getting from really good examples to something which is more routinely happening. Does that make sense? I'm sorry to kind of labour the point.
And I think that's a thumbs up from Mark, Katie, that there wasn't anything too academic in there either, was there, Mark? So thank you for that. So just before we move on to the final proceedings of the session, is there anything else that anyone wanted to add that maybe builds on what Katie just said then as well before we move on? Feel free to raise your hand, or Simon, I don't know if you were in a separate group, if there was anything that you wanted to feed back.
Yeah, just very briefly sort of dipped into group 7 where they were talking about the example Katie just gave, actually, the the ways in which things like funding and commissioning processes can actually work against collaboration, because people don't want to share their ideas for fear that somebody else will get the money and they'll miss out on it. And Alexia actually brought in her perspective, interestingly, from, you can speak for yourself if you want to, Alexia, hope I'm not misquoting you, but basically, you know, in a lot of sort of academic funding circumstances, actually, there's a requirement and expectation for collaborative bids, you know, so it was just sort of prompted that thinking about, well, you know, can we sort of set the criteria in ways that actually encourage collaboration rather than competition and between different organisations. And similarly with commissioning, I think it was Diane that talks about the ways in which you know, sometimes it can be hard for smaller organisations, community level organisations, to put in a bid for very big contracts, or through more if that kind of collaboration, that kind of engagement is more of a requirement of whoever's delivering the service, that could be moving towards you know, changing those processes so that actually they're encouraging collaborative ways of working.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon, and thank you everybody for your engagement throughout that particular discussion, and also up to this point as well. We really appreciate it. So as we come to the close of the session, Simon, did you just want to summarize the next steps in terms of what is coming next, I suppose, in terms of the further learning seminars?
Yes.
And then we can hopefully introduce the, have you got the feedback, Katie, the Padlet?
I'm hoping Simon's going to put the slides up with the Padlet and the links to the Padlet.
Yeah, sorry, bear with me a second. Just have it back in there in a sec. So what's the screen?
Perfect.
So yeah, basically to go over those next steps. Can people see that screen now? Yeah. The obviously we've got 3 more of these learning seminars. We're going to be looking at the sort of culture, how we sort of develop high levels of those sort of the community-led initiatives that are supported by programs in practice, and then one around, you know, where we're starting to see those sort of real changes in culture amongst communities, you know, which you can regard as you know, that's an indication of that things are already beginning to change on the ground in people's lives, which is what we're all about. So got colleagues from Bradford and Stockport respectively helping to share some of their learning on that, and then we're going to bring it all together as well in a final one where we sort of say what, you know, what's it tell us when we look at all these different kind of models together. What's that actually showing? So we're still sort of working on that synthesis of evaluation learning reports with CCA findings. So we'll have some more sort of written up accounts to share with people. It's been really helpful to sort of talk some of this through and get some sort of questions and feedback today. And obviously that will help inform what we then go on to share by the website and so on to help people with this. And of course that then helps feed into the next cycle, which will be starting at the beginning of September, when we'll be sending out the survey, inviting people to respond to the system agility assessments, basically. So watch this space. There'll be a lot more information coming through on that, and we look forward to talking to people more, you know, about what's going on in the places you're working as well.